Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Only 45 men have occupied the office of the presidency in the past 234 years. Each came to the office with a unique set of skills, flaws, and strengths, just as Joe Biden has. Most recently, we've had our boomer presidents in Clinton and Bush, a Gen Xer in Obama. Early JFK and Jimmy Carter came to the office unseasoned, and Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Lyndon Johnson arrived as fully formed political beings. Joe Biden comes to us not only as our oldest president, but one having lived a very long public life, during which we've watched him grow into the person and politician he is today. The degree to which he is still growing in that office is an open question, but one worthy of exploring. Every 4 years, our vote for president is essentially a gut check, a vote about the man in the moment. And sometimes, not always, but when we're really lucky, the man and the moment match up. It may be fair to say that that was the case with Joe Biden in November of 2020. But is it still the case? Most of us know that in deep interpersonal relationships, the things that attract us most about someone are the things that ultimately turn us away. Well, Joe Biden seemed to be the perfect antidote to Trump. Can his bent for normalcy, what attracted us to him, enable him to be the 21st century president we need at this moment? And what is his performance so far, halfway through his presidency? Tell us about what's ahead. All of this and a lot more is what my guest Chris Whipple explores in his new book, The Fight of His Life. Chris Whipple is an author, political analyst, an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. He's a frequent guest on MSNBC, CNN, and NPR, and has contributed essays to numerous publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, The Gatekeepers, a look at White House chiefs of staff, as well as his follow-up, The Spy Masters, based on interviews with every living CIA director. It is my pleasure to welcome Chris Whipple back to this program to talk about the fight of his life inside Joe Biden's White House. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thanks for that kind introduction.
Well, it is indeed great to have you here. It is so interesting to speculate, and obviously it is kind of an idle speculation, but to think about Joe Biden's presidency today in the context of what a Biden presidency might have been like the 2 previous times that he ran for the office, back in 1988 and in 2008. And it really speaks to how Joe Biden has grown and who he is today. Talk a little about that first.
Yeah, you referred earlier to Joe Biden meeting the moment in November 2020, and it is interesting to think of what might have been the case back in 1988 or 2008. Biden's whole life has been a fight against adversity and tragedy and bad luck. He lost 2 races for the presidency, and his father always told him, get up. And he did, and he finally won the presidency in 2020. I think he was a guy for that moment. I also think he was the man for the moment on November 24, 2022, when a Russian tyrant invaded a democracy in the heart of Europe. Nobody was better prepared or equipped to deal with that. But I see my book and the Biden presidency as a kind of political thriller in 3 acts. And the first act was the unbelievably fraught transition that almost didn't happen. We almost didn't have a peaceful transfer of power. It was the bloodiest transition since the Civil War, and I have untold stories about that, previously untold stories in my book. The second act was the first year of the Biden presidency, which was a rough ride, and it was really dominated by the bungled exit from Afghanistan, the slide in Biden's approval ratings. And then the third act, I believe the turning point of the Biden presidency was Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Biden rallying NATO and the West to face him down. And there followed, of course, a whole string of legislative victories, some of them bipartisan, as he pointed out last night, and then defying the odds in the midterms. So, I think Biden goes into his third year with considerable momentum.
How much, particularly of what you talk about of the first two acts in particular, and we'll get to Ukraine in a moment, but how much is the Biden presidency defined by its follow-on to Donald Trump?
Well, to a great extent. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that the defining tests of the Biden presidency are really three. One was to deal with a once-in-a-century pandemic and a crippled economy that resulted from it, and to wrestle that and come through it and put the U.S. Back on track. The second defining test, I would say, was Ukraine, which this is a case where we people have said periodically that for Vladimir Putin, conquering Ukraine is existential. I think that for Biden and the U.S. and the West, stopping Putin is existential. So there's that test. And then finally, there is the Trump test. And it's, the one thing that shocked Joe Biden more than anything else as president was the lasting power of Trumpism, of MAGA. He thought it would be in the rearview mirror long before now. He thought he had a 7 million vote mandate. And it's still with us. And I think he believes that democracy is still very much on the ballot in 2024. So those are, I think, the three defining tests of this presidency. They're what historians will be talking about.
What does he take away from coming to understand how long Trump and Trumpism is still around? What does that tell him about the country that he leads?
Well, it shocked him. And he's been wrestling with it throughout his presidency. And there's always been he's always tried to do two contradictory things. Number one, to unify the country, to be the anti-Trump, to lower the temperature and take us back to normal. And number two, to call out MAGA and Trumpism and the threat that it still represents. So he's always had that tension, and for a long time he didn't talk about the quote. He would refer to the former guy, but then as the presidency went on, and as he realized that it wasn't going away, he delivered that fiery anniversary speech, January 6th, the first anniversary, which was, I think, one of his best speeches. And he famously, before the midterms, talked a lot about the threat to democracy from MAGA. So I think that's been the evolution.
One of the things that's so interesting, certainly presidents are judged by previous presidents, but with Biden, it seems that there's the Trump comparison. There's the shadow of Trump that he's still dealing with, as you talk about, but there's also the shadow of Obama that he's still dealing with. Talk about that.
Yeah, I found it kind of fascinating as I spent 2 years talking to almost every member of Joe Biden's inner circle for my book, The Fight of His Life Inside Joe Biden's Presidency. And it wasn't easy, as you can imagine, because this is one of the most battened down, disciplined, leak-proof, on-message White Houses in modern times. They don't talk out of school much, but I was lucky to talk to all these people, and I was also able to get some pretty candid assessments of that relationship between Biden and Obama. It's been portrayed as a bromance, and that's true, but there's also, there's a real competitive, there's a little competitive friction there too. I mean, Obama and his aides were not at all thrilled when Biden's advisors were talking about him as FDR and during early on in his administration and complaining that Obama's stimulus back in 2009, that first stimulus bill, was small potatoes compared to what Joe Biden was going to do. And so there's a little friction between those two, and I think Biden obviously learned a lot from Obama and respects him, but they're competitive guys.
And you talk about the relationship, particularly David Axelrod and Plouffe, that there was a lot of tension there with Biden and his people.
Yeah, Joe Biden never felt that he had, but contrary to what some people have said about him. I mean, I love Anita Dunn, but at one point she said Joe Biden's the only Irishman who doesn't carry a grudge. I carry it for him. Not true. I mean, Biden carries a big chip on his shoulder. He's never been crazy about Ivy Leaguers. He graduated 200 something in his Syracuse law class, and has always never been thrilled by Ivy Leaguers who he thought didn't take him seriously. In the case of David Axelrod and David Plouffe, Obama's senior political advisors, Biden always felt that they didn't think Joe Biden, was presidential material. And a good friend of Biden's told me, he hates the Davids, as he put it.
Talk a little bit about the transition, because, and you really get to the heart of how crazy it was and how difficult it was, given what was going on with Trump and January 6th and everything else. But there's also a case that could be made that the chaos of the transition and the way all of the Biden people had to pull together to make it work really turned into an advantage as things went on. Talk about that.
Well, it may have, in the sense that it was such a trial by fire for the Biden team. I mean, it was just the most unbelievable, and by the way, a lot of it previously unreported story. I mean, oceans of ink have been written about Trump's final days, but I was shocked that I was able to kind of uncover this story about this little-known Trump staffer, a deputy chief of staff in the Trump White House named Chris Liddell, who not single-handedly, but under Trump's nose and without his knowledge, kept the wheels of the transition turning and managed to keep things moving forward, even as Trump was trying to overthrow the election. And reporting to Mark Meadows, who was also up to his eyeballs in trying to overthrow the election. So it came closer than anybody thought, and that story is really something. But I think that you're right. That when you come through a transition like that almost didn't happen, you form a bond. It was a great team. Jeff Zients, and who is now replacing Ron Klain as chief of staff, and Ted Kaufman, who was Joe Biden's alter ego, who replaced him in the Senate when he became VP to Obama, were running the transition. They ran a brilliant transition against all the odds.
Given the nature of the transition, when Biden finally came into office and all of his staff and so many of the people that you talked to in this book, did they have a clear plan at that moment what they wanted to do, or was there an element even more than most presidencies of building the plane while it was flying?
Well, it was very much building a plane while it was flying, I think. I mean, they had all kinds of plans, but, one of Jake Sullivan's, the National Security Advisor's favorite expressions, he stole from Mike Tyson, which is everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Right. And that certainly happened in the first year, and the Afghanistan withdrawal was certainly one example of it. Then of course the Delta variant came out of nowhere when they thought they had a handle on COVID, and there was a long slide in Joe Biden's approval rating. But these guys had a plan, and certainly it worked awfully well, all things considered, with COVID. I mean, Jeff Zients, the leader, led that team and the coronavirus response team, and they got 220 million Americans vaccinated in 100 days, saving thousands of lives. And so you got to give them a lot of credit.
And talk a little bit about Afghanistan and how much of The decisions that were made with respect to Afghanistan were decisions that were totally the function of the Biden administration, and how much were they stuck with the commitments that Trump had made, particularly with respect to withdrawing by May 1st?
Yeah, that was all practically mission impossible. Because of what Trump had did, and I'll explain in a second what Trump had done. You can argue with Biden's decision one way or the other. Should we have withdrawn when we did? Biden made the decision to withdraw. In my view, it was practically mission impossible because Trump had said in no uncertain terms that the U.S. would withdraw on May 1st of 2021. He'd had that half-baked negotiation with the Taliban. Once he declared that deadline, Biden, of course, ultimately moved it to August 31. But once that was declared, the writing was on the wall for the Afghan government and armed forces. They knew that the U.S. was going to hit the road, and ultimately they hit the road first. Plenty of mistakes were made in the execution of the withdrawal from Afghanistan by Biden's team. They didn't have enough troops on the ground. They had a cap of 700 as they tried to do it. The intelligence was bad. They thought the government would last much longer than it did. But it all goes back to Trump declaring that we were leaving. And I don't think there was much we could have done about that.
You were talking earlier about the leak-proof nature, the drama-free nature of the administration. Talk a little bit about that and why you think it's the case.
Well, let me put it this way. There was actually plenty of drama and continues to be plenty of drama behind closed doors. And that's, of course, why I was able to write this book. And I really did get an inside glimpse of a lot of colorful personalities and arguments about policy. But having said that, this is a very well-run White House, and there's a reason why great White House chiefs are hard to come by. It's a rare skill set. Ron Klain had it. Jim Baker under Ronald Reagan had it. Leon Panetta under Bill Clinton had it. The combination of White House experience, knowledge of Capitol Hill, political savvy, managerial acumen, a world-class temperament, which all the great ones have, and a relationship with the boss. Klain had it all, and that's one of the reasons why. And he had he had a very collegial approach to running the White House. You have to be able to manage down as well as up. You can't just manage the boss. You've got to inspire loyalty among the staff. Klain had all of that, and that's why it's a well-run White House.
Talk about Biden's temperament. We all know the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote about FDR, that he had a second-class intellect and a first-class temperament. Talk about temperament with respect to Biden.
Yeah, I've referred to Klain as having a world-class temperament, and by the way, I think Jeff Zients does too, and I think that will serve him well. I think Joe Biden is more complicated. I think by and large he's got a very, very strong temperament, but he's also got a pretty strong temper. And there were times, particularly during when he was grappling with the border, trying to figure out what to do about it. It's one of those thankless challenges where all the options are bad. And nobody's interested. Certainly the Republicans, for the most part, are not interested in a comprehensive solution. They just want to use it as a cudgel. So it's a classic example of what Rahm Emanuel told me once about how, if there's something's easy, someone else will handle it. Everything that gets into the Oval is between bad and worse. Anyway, roundabout way of answering your question, that Biden would lose it over the border. You would hear the F-bomb constantly. You could hear it throughout the West Wing. And, as one senior advisor put it to me, that's just the way he handles some of these really difficult challenges. He blows off steam.
Talk about his relationship with Vice President Harris. You talk a lot about that in the book, and it's very revealing, more than has been written anyplace else, really.
It's complicated and it's fascinating. Joe Biden clearly has a bond with her. He certainly had a real bond with her in the beginning. He wanted to have her in almost every meeting. He wanted her to attend. They were thrown together by COVID. She wasn't traveling much, neither was he. By all accounts, Biden really valued her input, liked the way she would cross-examine briefers, she's with her prosecutorial chops. But things got trickier as time went on, and she began to draw fire for her handling of the Northern Triangle on that awkward trip to Guatemala, where she was embarrassed by Lester Holt's question about going to the border. And then her allies began complaining that Biden had given her a much too difficult portfolio, that he'd in effect set her up for failure. The Northern Triangle, voting rights, how can anybody do that? And then it got back to Biden that the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, had been going around complaining about her portfolio. And this really just annoyed Joe Biden to no end. I mean, he thought, look, he wasn't asking Kamala Harris to do anything he hadn't done for Joe Biden. He had the Northern Triangle. He had tough assignments. And so it's complicated.
And where does that relationship stand today, do you think?
Well, I think it's probably pretty good. He certainly, I think he feels, as he told at one point, he told a close friend when asked about how the vice president was doing, he said, he rolled his eyes and he said, a work in progress. But having said that, she's made some real progress, I think, and he's given her some important national security roles. There's a great story I tell about, previously unreported, about Kamala Harris meeting with Zelensky on the eve of the invasion at the Munich Security Conference, where she tells him, look, not only are the Russians coming for Ukraine, they're coming for you and your family and your wife, and you better take this seriously. He still wasn't taking it quite seriously, still skeptical, and as she left, she turned to an aide and said, I wonder if that's the last time we see him alive. So I think Biden has given her some important assignments, and I think they probably got past that rough patch. We'll see.
I wonder if presidents that have been vice president have a more difficult time in dealing with their vice presidents. You think about George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle, Biden and Harris, as you're talking about. I mean, there's a question about how those that have been vice president then look at their own vice presidents.
Well, it can cut both ways, of course, because Biden knows better than anybody just how thankless the job can be, and just how unrewarding. It's a tricky act, and so I think that probably cuts both ways.
Talk a little bit about the age question and how you think Biden sees that in the context of running for re-election, and the degree to which he has to acknowledge to some extent that it is a real thing.
Well, I think the way he'll acknowledge it is the way he did in the State of the Union address. That was, I think, the best speech of his presidency. Prior to that, I would have said the January 6th anniversary speech or the Warsaw speech, when he famously ad-libbed about Putin. But last night he was, just absolutely focused, and I thought really energetic and aggressive, and I think that's the way he's going to try to deal with the age question. I think he's going to, in effect, he's going to say, "Watch me." That didn't look like to me, that really did not look like an old man last night during the State of the Union. I mean, he owned Marjorie Taylor Greene and the and the crazies who heckled him in what, by the way, ironically, was really his ad-libbed moment when he got them all to stand up and basically stand in opposition to cutting Social Security and Medicare. You couldn't have scripted that. But I think that's the way Biden's going to address it. He's going to just try to convince people that he's up to the job.
And finally, what is his take on all the MAGA crazies? And what does he think about that? It's certainly not something that he has encountered before, even in his long political career.
Again, the thing that shocked him more than anything else as president, and he thought that it would be behind us by now. He is old school. This is new to him, as it is for the rest of us since Donald Trump came on the scene, and I think he takes it very seriously. I think that the Biden White House believes that Donald Trump will likely be the nominee. They're focused on him, and Joe Biden believes that democracy is still very much on the ballot. So that's one of the reasons, hardly the only one, but one of the reasons he's running for re-election.
And does he feel a special concern about that? I mean, this is more than, it sounds like from the way you describe it, it's more than just running against an opponent who has a different set of policy ideas, that it is much more consequential.
No, it's absolutely a defining test of this presidency, and I really believe that Joe Biden looks at this. This goes back for him. This goes back to Charlottesville, which was the moment that triggered his run for the presidency. This is a continuation of that. He sees these dark authoritarian forces out in broad daylight. Mike Donilon, his closest advisor and wordsmith, said, "Look, that was a door that Joe Biden felt he had to close." He felt that way at Charlottesville. He sees Vladimir Putin and his troops as another manifestation of that dark movement, and Donald Trump as a threat to democracy. So, it's a defining test of his presidency.
Chris Whipple, the book is The Fight of His Life Inside Joe Biden's White House. Chris, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.